Here we are, August office hour, and I guess we're going to talk about interiority, which goes by a lot of other names, internal dialogue, internal monologue, state of mind, all kinds of things. Where should we start? Gail, why don't you start us off with some of your thoughts, or where you want to pick up the discussion?
So I'm going through my novel again, and my goal was to deepen and enrich the main character's life, his experience on the page. And so my initial thought about doing that was to add more sentences from his point of view about how he sees the world, or how he's seeing, various things in his world, to sort of like ground the reader in his point of view. So I got into this discussion with Seth about this, and I was using the term interiority. But we had a really interesting discussion yesterday, and I like the idea of state of mind and how you explore that. I think that's really more what I need to be looking at this point. And how to express that, without just through info dumping and getting into too much exposition, and sort of balancing it. And as I'm doing that, the character is becoming more and more real to me, and presenting more of his frame of mind to me to put, to translate onto the page. So that's where my thoughts started.
I think in a novel or in a short story, you want to develop the character's emotional arc. So you want to spend some time inside the character's head. When I was teaching the mystery writing class, we would read a story by Dashiell Hammett, The Gutting of Coufignal, which is in first person with the Continental Op, and then a story by Patricia Highsmith, The Terrapin, which is in third person, which is about a boy in a New York City apartment. And in the first person story, instinctively we think the first person is going to be a lot closer to the character's feelings and thoughts, and we're going to get more of the character's thoughts. But it turns out that the character knows who committed the crime pretty early on in the story, but we never find that out, and we don't find out who committed the crime until the end of the story. And then we find out through the character's dialogue that he knew all along and who it was and all that stuff. And then in The Terrapin, which is third person, we get way into the character's thoughts and how he feels about this turtle that his mother is going to cook, and how he feels about his mother, and just like all these thoughts and feelings come out. We get way into the character's headspace. And so it's ironic because we see that you can get a lot closer in third person. But the key there is to keep the narrative voice consistent. Part of this is funny because, Liz and Bennett, this is Bennett, everybody. Hey, Bennett from Northern California. Is that a slide projector? Oh my God.
Carousel.
I got
ancient slides for digitization.
Nice. I just saw a whole box of my father's slides from his trip to Africa in 1962.
Oh my God, this is from my trip to Africa in 1964.
Where?
Kenya, Tanzania.
He was in Tanzania, formerly Tanganyika, and he lived there. We'll talk about this later. But I got, upstairs is all the paraphernalia that I have in the house now from that trip. So in the long term, I used to get like way up on this soapbox and like rail against people doing like thoughts as dialogue in their writing. And Liz and I used to go around about this because in some of the YA books that are popular, we see stuff like this a bit. And so, a pet peeve that I have that I've gotten less, as I've gotten older, I've gotten less finicky or upset about it, is like seeing writers pop into italics to like say a character's thought or something like that. So the two things that we see, the two things that I see with early writers in terms of interiority are that they'll either like put a character's thought in there in italics, or they'll treat it as though it's dialogue, and they'll have like the thought and then comma Henry thought or something like that. And we see this in first person and in third person. And to me that feels really jarring as a reader, because we're changing the narrative voice, we're changing the tactic of how we're interacting with the writer, or the writer interacting with the reader. And I see it as sort of an early writer mistake that makes for transitions and makes the writing harder for the reader to read. So I've like in the past railed against interior monologue or interior dialogue. And one of the things that early writers I think really need to do is start to create their scenes visually and on the page, and in where people are interacting. Oh, Trisha's raising her hand, which is great. And so I really push people away from interiority or internal monologue, because for the most part, people don't have enough concrete stuff on the page and showing of their characters. But for a writer like Gail, whose work I've been reading for a while, like she's got great scenes all throughout her book, and you see the characters, you see everything that they're doing. And so now that she's at the point where she's really dramatized the whole book and she wants to deepen the character's emotional arc, it makes sense to try to put in that interiority. So we're talking about how to do that. And part of that involves slowing down and giving the reader time inside the character's head. But it really needs to be balanced by having a lot of other stuff that's outside the character's head to ground the reader and make the reader feel like that world is understood. And then once you do it, I think it's just really important to keep the narrative style the same and not go into like putting things in italics or thoughts and stuff like that. Trisha?
I'm not sure how parallel this is, but I think it's relevant. When I was preparing for the story slam, one of the things the producer was, what we had to do is prepare a story to tell that fit into like 11 minutes. And as I was preparing, there was a section in which I was talking a lot about how I felt. And she said, the word that you're using, the word happened to be hideous, can mean different things to different people. She said, you have to present this as a story. What is the story? What is the concrete example to tell us exactly how you're feeling? And so I think sometimes, as long as you're slowing down, instead of saying he felt like a fish out of water, he felt like an outsider, you present this little anecdote, and it doesn't have to be a full-blown out story, but it's an anecdote that gives us more of a portrait, a picture of how he's feeling, rather than him just telling us. Because, you know, our first person narrators, when they're describing their own feelings, they're actually not always dependable, because, you know, we don't always see ourselves correctly. And so giving us a little example that kind of gives us an idea of how he's feeling, it was a suggestion that really helped my story, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's like, you know, the idea of like saying, you know, Tom felt sad, it does so much less on the page for a reader than if you start to narrate or show Tom's body language. And that's where the writing gets more visual. The reader gets really involved. The writing really picks up. And you can do interiority stuff like Tom thinking about, you know, when his dog died or something like that, or the time that his date stood him up. But if you just say like Tom felt sad, that's like really basic telling. And then there's a level below that that's like, I'm sad, comma, Tom thought, or this is the worst, exclamation mark, in italics. And then the reader gets that that is in Tom's head. But I object because it's like jarring from going like outside of Tom, like boom, inside of Tom. It's It's funny because I like to do this illustration and it's really good on Zoom. Like when I was learning how to do a video camera, there's like in the old days when they had video cameras, you could like zoom in and out with the buttons gradually, and it would be like, and that looks fine on camera. But then there's also like that stick that you could like move up and down. It would be like, and it's like if you do that to a reader by going in and out of someone's head, it feels really jarring just to do it like 1 second to the one sentence to the next, one paragraph to the next. And so I like not having that transition at all and just kind of like keeping it in a single narrative voice. And so going in and like showing Tom or letting the reader know that Tom is thinking about the time that his dog died. He thought about when his dog died and he crossed his feet and looked at the ground, using that blend of body language and thinking, that feels good to me. And that's what I think, that's what you're talking about, Trisha, and the parts of your story where you're showing they really worked. And we saw this with your novel, Jennifer. When you first brought your novel to me, it was so much interior stuff. And then
it was all in my head. And yeah, and you made that really strong point, which I really took to heart because I saw somebody in another class I was in, I saw somebody writing that way. And it makes, if you just keep them inside, it's like you're making the reader into a prisoner of your head, of the character's mind, and it gets very claustrophobic and it's not fun at all. But I guess there's something else I wanted to say about what is Trisha was saying too about and about what you're saying. If you can show what's happening in physical space, it can be so meaningful. I was watching Roger Ebert did a whole discussion about Casablanca, and he spent like a good 15 minutes talking about the way the director of photography filmed Ilsa, and he talked about how the light was on her, showing part of her face was in shadow, and in some parts like her lower lip would pout a little bit and make her look so vulnerable, but then you could understand how much she was in love with the character Rick. And he talked for 20 minutes about how the character's face conveyed the emotion of what was happening in Casablanca. And what he was saying was that was one of the tricks or the reasons for why Casablanca is such a powerful movie, is because of the way they depicted the characters and what they were going through. And I thought that was such a good lesson, because if you could learn to write that, as well as the director of photography was photographing it, and why couldn't you just be describing what the photographer was showing it through his camera lens, but if you could describe it in words, or at least if you could try to get better at describing it in words, it could really be just so powerful. And I thought that was a kind of a huge lesson in interiority for me, because yeah, I'm trapped in my own head all day. And so if I can just think of it as being like a fun thing to say, okay, this is what's going on in their head, but how do you show what it is that's going on in their head? That would be, if I can look at it as a fun thing instead of a hard thing, because it's a very hard thing for me.
I think as writers begin, that early sort of the low-hanging fruit, the easier stuff to write is what the characters are thinking. And so early on, it seems harder to do the showing, but as you practice it, it gets easier to do, and you can just work on really showing what the characters are doing. And it works for readers. Like, we live in a visual world. We're used to seeing things, and we see in film like a lot going on. We don't get inside the characters' heads. We just get the dialogue, and we're reading what's going on with them by seeing how the actor looks. And sometimes when I'm reading something and it's like all inside the character's head, I feel like I'm in a black box. Like, I want to know, like, what does the kitchen look like? Like, who's across the table from this person? What is the light? Like, I want to see more of the visual stuff. So when I'm in that like black box thing, I get really discouraged as a reader.
I see a lot of that in memoir. I mean, obviously memoir is going to be in first person, but the easy thing to do, I think, in memoir is to just say, I felt, I did. And after a while, it's like, blah, 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 blah. Who cares about you? But, you know, but it actually is harder. And I think, but more rewarding to tell stories about your life that are interesting rather than just saying to the reader, trust me, this is what happened, or trust me, this is the way I feel, to give examples. And in fiction, I would think, Jennifer, you're right, that would be a fun thing. Oh, he feels paranoid. Let's think of a reason. Why would he be paranoid?
Well, the thing that's fun too is to think about if he's paranoid, like, and he's in a train station, or what room is he in? Like, how would he be looking at that room? And so to do it by the visual details, you can convey the character's state of mind. Like if he's looking to the right and looking to the left, and like there's a lot of different details around it, it can show that the character might be really agitated or really relaxed. And so really the control of details that you use is another great way from an interior point of view to get across the character's emotions. There's a great point of view exercise in the John Gardner book, The Art of Fiction, where you're supposed to show like a barn and a lake and another thing from the point of view of a woman whose husband just died, or someone who got great news. And so that's an option that's out there.
I hate to, I told Seth this before, I've got to cut off because I've got a work meeting. But one thing, and Seth may have heard me talk about this before, this book, the Paris Apartment, I read, and actually all of her books, Lucy Foley, are like this, which I've read another, I don't know if they're all like this, but another one is like this. Each chapter is told by a different character. And it's sort of like the chapter is like, you know, Charlie or Rebecca or, you know, Lawrence or whatever. And the interiority for those, each character is giving, I listened to it on audiobook and it was riveting. And it was about sort of this murder mystery that happens in this Paris apartment building. And each character is telling a little, it's like a, you know, like a octagonal hexagon, like diamond like thing. And each of their different facet of the story. But this, you couldn't tell the story with just the objective events. You know, you need each character's little memories of the person who was murdered, and it was just brilliant.
First person or third person?
First person, yeah.
Oh, that's a challenge.
Yeah, all different kinds of, you know, each character. There's say 7 or 8 main characters. Each has a different voice that she's telling in the first person. So I thought that was like, wow. She pulled that off.
Yeah, that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thanks.
I will be back if I can, if this meeting wraps up. So,
Okay.
But really good to see y'all if I don't.
Thanks, Tara. I'm happy to stay on the interiority train if you guys have more to say about it.
So one thing, you know, I always find it's difficult is how to do that, right? Because I often get like paralysis when I'm like, okay, I need to make this perfect on the first draft, right? And then I just freeze up and I can't do anything. So I think the key to this is just like word vomit out your first draft and then look at those spots where you said like, she looks sad, and then figure out like, okay, that's a section I want to expand. And then you almost like don't need to even erase the
Uh-oh.
once you go back, you can be like, decide which parts you even.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think I froze.
We can hear you now. You want to try?
Yeah, the
You're
internet,
saying-
yeah, the internet's weird today. But yeah, almost like using your first draft as like scaffolding to expand out other spots and kind of figure out like, you know, if you say like, she looks sad, that could be a spot you want to expand more. Because if I just try from the first draft to make it perfect and have the correct balance, like it's going to freeze me up and I'm not going to do it. So I think, you know, just tinkering with it eventually, you'll kind of get to a spot where you want to be at.
Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, you're gonna write some things well, and then some things are really challenging. No matter where we are, there's always something that we're not comfortable with. And so for me, it used to be like transitions from like scene to scene or like day to day. How do I get time to span in the novel? And the first thing that's really important is to give yourself permission to do it poorly. Like, oh, I know I need to do a transition from this scene to the next one. And rather than just cutting and jumping, which I see some people do, like I know that it's going to be hard to do it. And so I'm going to do it. Let me give myself permission to do it poorly the first time, and then it'll get better as I work on it. Yeah.
Seth, you mentioned transitions. Could
My
I ask you
favorite.
about transitions, for example, from narration, let's say third person narration, to inner thought?
Yeah.
Because I find myself rarely wanting to do that, and I will use some sort of a body language, like he did this, he did this, he did this. He shook his head and then has a thought that seems to ease the abruptness of moving from just narration into inner thought. Is there such a thing as a transition between
I think
narrative?
so. Yeah. I mean, I love that you're thinking about the transition, because if you're thinking about the transition, then you're not just going to like pop in and out of them all the time. I mean, the real danger comes when a writer doesn't know that they're going in and out of this interiority. So they do it all over the place. But if you're thinking about a transition and you have something like she looked out the window, and then you kind of go into a more pensive thing,
Exactly.
I think that works really well. I mean, essentially, the thing about transitions is that those are parts that are hard for the reader to navigate. So if you know you're making a transition from one kind of writing showing into someone's head, if you can create a bridge or a transition that helps lead the reader through that path, it only helps the reader. And then I like hear these other like writer fear voices that might be like, but that's going to slow down the narrative. That's going to bore someone. And it's like, if everything you're worried about is boring the reader, you're not going to offer the reader opportunities to slow down and engage and see the writing, or see the how the writer starts his car, or like how much snow he has to wipe off his car before he starts driving, or something like that. We call that the connective tissue.
I also find that sometimes the transitions we do are for us as writers, and that when we go back, I mean, I think it's really good and important to put those transitions in. I'm sorry for the cacophony. My dogs are protecting me from the pressure washer back there. Then when we go back and reread, we're like, oh, I don't need that there. But I think it's a really important, almost a placeholder for us to put in so that we can continue going.
Yeah. Yeah, just to shift course a little bit and then keep going. One of the things that I remember you and I thinking about a lot, Liz, was like in a scene where some characters are involved in dialogue and you've got a first person narrator. Sometimes there's an urge, particularly with I find this a lot in YA or with young narrators. They're in a conversation with someone and there's a lot of interiority where that character is interpreting what the other person is saying. And I feel like that occasionally there's an urge to do that, but it's got to be a balance. It can't be like a new thought by the character interpreting every line of dialogue after every line of dialogue. Like it needs to be just sort of sprinkled in here or there.
One thing that we also would talk about a lot is like when it's appropriate to have the interiority. Like if you're in the middle of like a fight scene or something like that, and like the action's really at the front, then
Yeah.
that's not really an appropriate time to be like commenting on what his shoes look like, or like whatever.
Yeah.
Unless that's like totally pivotal to the character or something like that, And so kind of like, when are there more quiet times of reflection? And then when is the action or the dialogue, or when is the character more present and not having interior thoughts? Like if
Right.
you're stuck in like a business meeting and your mind is wandering, fine, like I would always like be thinking about other things when I'm supposed to be present. And so the character could do that too, you know, and so it would just have to be like, appropriate for them.
Yeah, the business meeting is a time for a flashback, not in the middle of a fight scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
I think maybe another aspect to this is like really good mindfulness, like body awareness. I guess an example that comes up for me was my protagonist being really shocked into like a combination of shock and embarrassment. And it's just like the heat that rises to her face in that moment. And then a moment of stammering. I don't have to explain at all what's going on there. Everybody knows what that's like, but it was like incredible embarrassment and shock. So the more we know in ourselves how feelings and thoughts feel in the body, the easier is it to write that. And then it's showing, not telling. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
I like that.
totally. But I also, in hearing what you're saying, it also comes through that you're imagining how the character's body feels in that moment. And so that's another critical part of the writing process, is imagining what the character is going through, seeing the room that the character's in, and even to the point of like feeling what's going on with the character's body. You know, something like the heat or what you're saying sounds a lot, would work so much better because it's original and it's organic, than saying like, you know, she had ice in her veins, sweat dripped down her spine. Something like that reads as like false immediately.
I find it really challenging to keep doing this and keeping it fresh. You know, I think that's what we're talking about, spine. I think there is some spine drip, sweat dripping down his spine, and you know, my first draft, and you read it later, like, and you're horrified. So how do how do you keep it's, and like all of these millions of books that have been published, people have been finding fresh ways to say these things, and it I feel a little empty on the fresh ways of expressing physical reactions or physical gestures. But yeah.
When I was working with Chris Offutt, he would like just like grab, like write down little snippets like that, like gestures or things that he felt or things that he observed other people doing. And he would just like keep note cards and write them down whenever he noticed them in the world. And then later he would go back and put them onto his computer in a file. So he had like this file that he was always growing of like organic, original gestures or feelings or movements. And then when he got to a place in a story where he was stuck or he needed one of those, he would go look at that and then pick one out.
It's a great idea.
So authors that have written many books, they've been doing this for a long time, and is there a point where like all of that just disappears from the reading experience? Because how can you say the same things so many times, and how so my question is there a way of doing it where it just flows by the reader? Do you know what I'm trying to ask? Or am I not being really clear?
I think I do. I mean, I
get
think you're trying to avoid cliches, basically, that there's like, if you're talking about, let's go to the sweat dripping down the spine, how do you not say that? How do you say it differently? There's only so many different ways to say it. I mean, I would say that there's kind of infinitely different ways to say it, depending on the person. Everybody feels sweat differently. You know,
Yeah.
maybe for you, I mean, you could sweat in Florida, just go outside for 30 seconds, you know, and I mean, he felt his shirt sticking to his neck, or he felt his hair start to curl in his perspiration or something. I mean, I think there are different ways to say it because it does affect different people. I don't usually actually feel sweat dripping down my spine because I have clothes on, you know, so I don't feel that. So I think I think that you are you're better at that than you think you are. I don't remember cliches in your first book at all. And I think you put the cliches in first and then you go back and revisit them and think, oh, how could I say this a little bit differently?
I think that, yeah, I hear you, Gail. And I think, you know, probably you're looking at your writing in a way that most readers wouldn't, because you have some of your writing is going to really draw the reader in, and they're not going to be looking at it with as critical of an eye as you are. Like, you're likely to be very critical and really hard on your work. I think the
Yes.
point that I'm making is that, like, the writer who says, you know, who just like goes to the cliche isn't really dialed into what that character is feeling. And so if you're really dialing into your character, you're not going to fall to the cliche, because you're not even thinking about the cliche or the language. You're thinking about exactly what room she's in, what she's looking at, you know, what she's wearing, you know, the temperature, just because you're like imagining all these scenes in your head. Like in the Maltese Jordans, like I'm imagining Jack Palms in this hotel lobby in New York City. I know the air conditioning is on. I know the plants look like this. He's had a couple of drinks that's liable to affect him like this. He's sitting in this kind of a chair. So, you know, I think the organic method of just really dialing into your character, that's kind of the answer to all these questions. Like, if you're really thinking about your character, you don't care about cliches, and probably you're not going to find them, or a reader's not going to find them in your book. But if you like go through your book like with a fine tooth comb, you could probably find some things that piss you off or that you think might be cliches. But in reality, when you're writing, I know you, like when you're writing, you're not thinking about the words so much and just defaulting to like, oh, how did he feel? Nervous, spine dripping sweat. Boom. That's what nervous means. And so, you know, you're dialed into your character. There's going to be good stuff there on the page.
But it is true. There are moments when you look at your work and you think, you know, I've been on autopilot. I've written 3 pages of dialogue. How many times have I said, he sighed, she sighed, he turned, she turned, he smiled, she smiled. I mean, you need to smack yourself upside the head once in a while and find something different to say.
For me, when I was younger and I was trying to do my 2000 or 2500 words a day, that's when I was doing that kind of writing. But as I like eased back my expectations of myself, and I wanted to do like 1000 words a day, something more doable, if I don't have the word, or I don't have something up better than side, and I know I've used that, I'll just, you know, Frank Conroy would call it ruminating on the text, or like marinating in the situation. You just sit and like imagine it in your head. Yeah, and something comes.
You mentioned it once when you talked about how wonderful it was to have a scene, for example, in the kitchen. So the physicality had so many unique options of peeling the carrots or chopping the cucumbers or
Yeah.
handing the bowl of whatever to so-and-so, that it was like automatically fresh.
Well, the thing that I think that sometimes with early writers, I see, we talk about verbs and like action verbs or thinking verbs or linking verbs. And one of the things that I see early writers doing sometimes is taking a lot of good action verbs and like jamming them into a sentence together. Like, he came into the house and opened the door and went to the refrigerator and pulled out some tomatoes. And it's like, you know, as a reader, if I see each of those actions individually, it starts to build up a chronology and a timeline for me. And so I like it when that takes 4 or 5 sentences and I might get some description. But, you know, I think early writers have this feeling that I'm so worried that I'm going to bore people. I just got to like keep it running fast. So they jump these things into a line, or it's like he walked into the house as he was removing his hat, and then he sat down and did this. And it's like, well, did he really walk in simultaneously? So then we get these weird relationships of like, he did this as he did that. It's not really happening at the same moment. So then it's not really true on the page. yeah, lately I've been looking at some people's sentences and like really breaking them up. Like if you've got more than two verbs, good action verbs in a sentence, like break them up, make them into shorter sentences and show the individual beats of the movements that the character is going through.
Question, do you think it's better to just word vomit out 2,000 words and just get something on the page, or is it better to be thinking about it and only get 1,000?
It depends on what your goal is. Like when I was younger, I wanted to prove something to myself. So I had to like prove my worthiness to myself. And so doing more words was something like that. But if I look back on some of those pages, it's like, if I would have done fewer words in a given day, I might have taken more time for research or more time to really figure out what's going on with the character. You know, the depth of the relationship to the writing can enhance when you're doing something more slowly. You know, there was this interview with John Grisham where he said he writes 200 words a day. And if he does it that way, he has a book a year. And it's like John Grisham has made a ton of money as a writer. He's clearly a legitimate writer. And of all the writers that I know that I've met at conferences, like no one that I've ever met would say something like, I do 200 words a day. It's like this one guy's like, I do 5,000 words a day. Someone else does 1,500 words a day. Someone does three. It's like no one is in that range. Everyone is like trying to like work themselves to a nib. And you know, when I started taking more time and writing the last book, the Maltese Jordans, I did more research, and that's where all the fun sneaker stuff came from. And so I was having more fun as I was writing. And I think that enthusiasm translated across to the reader and just made the book more fun and brought in more quirky, weird, original details that people would want to go see if it's real or not. Whereas like when I was doing like the second Jack Palms book, maybe 10 years before that, I was just trying to bang out like 2,000 words or 2,500 words. And I remember feeling like there were these long dialogue scenes and I didn't really know where it was going. And I wasn't sure where to edit or how to cut. And yeah, I think, you know, when I was younger, it was like, I got to get those metrics. And now that I'm older, I can see slowing down a bit more was good for me.
So you're down to 100 pages a day, 100 words a day.
100 words a day. And when I was in grad school, Ethan Kanan used to say, you know, if you can do 10 minutes a day, that's all you've got to do. And a lot of the days, the 10 minutes will wind up being more than that. But if you do a minimum of 10 minutes a day, you're good. And if you're living in Iowa and you only write for 10 minutes a day, you got a lot of work to figure out what to do with the rest of your day. So we were writing as much as we could possibly stand. But I think the idea coming from an older writer saying, you know, 10 minutes a day, particularly once you have kids and a life and all this, it's just that consistent connection back to the story, back to the piece. It's how many times you connect to it in a given week more than it is like how many hours you spend. I think if you write 5 times in a week for 15 minutes each, you'll get better over the long run than if you write once a week for 5 hours or 3 hours or something. I've seen a lot of.
I've been where you are, you know, with raising the kids, and I should put my video back on so you can see me talking. I'm sorry I talk so much, guys. I just have a lot
What
to
are you
say.
talking about? We love you talking.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I like to hear my own voice. But when my kids were little, I would do a lot of planning writing in my head. So like when you are, you know, rocking river or, you know, doing baby things, because I find it hard to sit down and write for 10 minutes because it takes me 10 minutes to kind of figure out what I'm doing and to, you know, get my page open. And but if you have an idea in your head brewing, even if it's only 10 minutes worth of work, then it's a lot easier to sit down and say, oh, I know exactly what I want to get down and write for those 10 minutes. as opposed to just, you know, sitting down kind of with a blank slate. I used to use a lot of my kid time for planning what I was going to writing. And I used my kids in a lot of my writing too, because my kids are so weird. And so they were always giving me something to write about.
Well, I think too, it's like that ability to keep thinking about the writing comes when you're working on it consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you almost can't get it out of your head.
Yeah, that's the sweet spot when you're really working with it and it's growing.
I sent you that, like that piece I sent you yesterday. And I thought about it all night long. I was awake and kept thinking about it. And I was like, no, I got to redo that. I got to redo it. I got to redo it. And so the first thing I did today was go through it and resend it, because I just couldn't stop thinking about how everything I left out.
Cool.
No.
Nice. I started reading your book last night.
I didn't know you were going to read my book. Thank you.
I didn't know I was going to read your book either. I was up and I said, I want to know what's going on with this book. There's a lot. Yeah.
There's a lot going on in that book.
There's a lot of pregnancy tests and
A lot of
anxiety.
pregnancy tests. Yeah. I took a lot of pregnancy tests when I hadn't even had sex, because that's how Catholic girls are.
That was interesting.
But the funny thing about that book, I mean, you talk about how things are all constantly evolving. And I think this is more a nature of memoir and creative nonfiction. You know, when I finished that book, I was like, wow, my life is so imperfectly perfect. You know, I have these 3 awesome kids. I've got this amazing husband. I'm going to make it. My life, I'm doing my life. I'm doing things right. When the book came out, unbeknownst to me, that's about when my husband started cheating on me. I didn't know that. And 2 years later, the weekend of the pandemic, he left me. So like after my book comes out and I think, I got it going on, everything's all right. And then my daughter is diagnosed with lupus. My husband leaves me. The pandemic happens. And I'm on the verge of losing my job. And I'm like, oh, it looks like I need a part 2 of my memoir. And so I kept writing.
That's a staggering amount of things.
Anyway, well, after all of my blabbing, I have to go now.
Yeah, we're gonna wrap up in a minute.
Okay.
I thought, but I also saw Gail had something to say.
Oh,
I was just gonna say that I love reading your blog, My Left Hook, and you're just really brilliant at describing your life and doing it in such a way that's actually uplifting at the same time. Just want to encourage you to keep at that.
thank you, Gail.
Not that you need my encouragement, but I love it.
I do. You have been an inspiration now for how many years? How long have we known each other?
A long time.
A long
10
time.
years. Yeah.
Yes.
Fearlessly authentic.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there we go. We've talked about interiority, transitions, all the good things. And I think that's what we have time for this month. I really appreciate you guys showing up. Glad to be here, or glad to see you all. Yeah. What else? Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks, Seth.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Enjoy the conversation.